Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donohue, and we have plenty to get to here on our latest episode. If you missed our first episode of this week, the first week of April, we had Brandon Short on the program, a All-American linebacker with the Nittany Lions back in 1999, now a member of the Board of Trustees for the university. He went in-depth on the obstacles, the opportunities in an evolving college athletics landscape that Penn State is facing right now, some of the infighting happening that we've seen spill out into the public situation, all that addressed by Brandon Short on the last episode. So check that one out. It went live on Tuesday night, so check that out. But right now on a Thursday morning, we shift gears toward the latest piece of news coming from the Nittany Lions football program. That's the addition of transfer running back Trey Potts, a Big Ten veteran, spent the last 4 seasons with Minnesota. We saw him here in Happy Valley running the ball against the Nittany Lions last October. He'll be joining the group, and obviously it's an interesting running back situation this spring that we've covered quite a bit with Nick Singleton, the 2022 Big Ten Freshman of the Year, and Katron Allen, who was a phenomenal freshman in his own right, back on board. But those are the only 2 scholarships involved right now in the running back room until the summer, when you're getting Cam Wallace up from Georgia, London Montgomery here, an in-state prospect. But let's remember, Montgomery missed his entire senior season with a knee injury. Potts now entering the equation, set to make his practice debut in August. We're not going to wait until then to start talking about his addition and the impact, though. We bring in Ryan Burns right now, who covers the Minnesota Golden Gophers for 247 Sports. You've seen him here on the podcast leading up to some of those Minnesota matchups in recent years. And, hey, it's the current reality of college football. We're going to see the interconference the transfers, something that we never saw was even possible, where a guy could go from one conference team to another and play that upcoming season. But that's going to be the case for Trey Potts. And let's begin here. What was your initial reaction to this move for Potts?
Yeah, I was surprised, I'll be honest, because when you look at some of the circumstances about why Trey Potts left Minnesota, I think it was multifaceted. I would say his running back coach for the entire time here at the University of Minnesota was a guy by the name of Kenny Burns. Kenny Burns is now the head coach at Kent State University in the MAC. So I was kind of expecting to see him potentially go there to get guaranteed carries. But I think when the opportunity came along for a Pennsylvania kid to go to Penn State, I think that's something to even where Trey Potts even can't pass it up, because one of the other circumstances about him leaving was this is a running back room that does lose one of the best running backs in the history of the program, and Muhammad Ibrahim, and there's carries up for grabs. But it sounds like the staff here was honest with him and saying they didn't think that he was going to be a 20-plus carry a game guy here. And I think that also played into his decision. So it was a little surprising to me, but honestly, to hear you kind of describe the situation that's going on in the running back room in Happy Valley, it makes a lot of sense to me, where he gets to go home, which I think is the most important thing for Trey. Is I remember covering him coming out of high school. He had knee injuries, and Penn State was one that he wanted to be an opportunity. And I don't think there was a committable offer when he ended up signing with Minnesota. And that's where now he gets to put his name back into the portal. Now he gets to play a lot closer to home. He gets to provide depth for a running back room that's obviously very talented. But for him, I think that going home makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, this goes back to that 2019 recruiting class that saw Penn State pick up a couple top 24/7 running back recruits. One was Noah Kane, left the program following the Outback Bowl in 2021, and then a Devin Ford, who stepped aside from the roster during this past 2022 season. They were both top-tier running back recruits, and as you just mentioned, Potts dealing with some of those injuries late in his high school career, still put together a phenomenal stat sheet at Williamsport Area High School, 3,500 rushing yards, about 10 per carry, 60 touchdowns, despite missing much of the action as an upperclassman. But Penn State wasn't an opportunity coming out of high school. He commits to Minnesota, ends up in the Big Ten. That offer list had some other notable regional options like Rutgers, Syracuse. There was some Ivy League involvement in there as well. But let's go to his journey in Minneapolis, because he gets to campus. He has kind of that traditional redshirt year where you don't see much of him. Can you talk about the early growth and what the early feedback was on Trey Potts before he stepped up and became a consistent contributor for Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean, that's where it's going to be. It starts in that 2021 season where Minnesota sees Muhammad Ibrahim go down in that opening game against Ohio State. He's tearing him up through 3 quarters, and he ends up popping his Achilles, and then Trey Potts has to be thrust onto the scene. So that's where it's going to be. You see those next kind of 3-4 games where he gets 25, 30 carries a game, and he actually looks really good doing it. And then it comes into that Purdue game where there's still a lot of ambiguity about the situation, but here's the best way I could probably describe it is he's having a pretty good game against a Purdue run defense that seemingly always gives Minnesota fits. It's the fourth quarter and it's a monsoon. I'm there at the game in West Lafayette, and he has he has a carry going to the far sidelines, and he goes down. He gets up, and then he motions for somebody to come back on to take his spot, and then he is just surrounded by trainers. And you're like, okay, so Minnesota ends up winning the game, and then we're in West Lafayette waiting for, I think, PJ Fleck, and we see Trey Potts get into an ambulance, and we're like, oh boy. And then it comes out that Trey Potts, I believe, spends the next 4 nights in the hospital. There's a lot of ambiguity about the situation. Trey Potts has not spoken to the Minnesota media since that game. But the best way I can describe it is a non-traditional football injury, and it's an upper body injury, something that shouldn't inhibit him, as far as I understand it, from playing the game of football right now. But the thing for him is, I had heard for the rest of that 2021 season, there was a lot of doubt that he was ever going to be cleared to play football again. He ends up getting cleared to play football, and then he gets here into the 2022 season where ends up getting 100 carries, nearly 500 yards on the ground. And that's where you kind of look at his season last year. Yeah, it's tough for running back in my mind. And again, from what I've been told, never played the running back position at a high level to kind of have the role that he did last year, where he was just spelling Mohamed Ibrahim. So when he did get carries, it felt like at times he was pressing. I think a lot of Minnesota fans would tell you that their last, and unfortunately, again, it's, the Purdue game for them, 1 year removed from him, for him, that 2022 game where Mo misses the game and Trey has, I think, nearly 9-10 carries, doesn't force a missed tackle. No Minnesota running back forces a missed tackle the entire game, and Minnesota loses. So, and that's where it's going to be interesting for me, because he did get better the rest of the season, but there were certainly spots throughout that season where you would see Trey Potts potentially bounce a carry, and you would see Fleck irate on the sidelines, and he would pull him, and we would never see Trey Potts again for the rest of that game. I think that happened in the Wisconsin game at the end of the season. So for Trey, there have been flashes, but it's going to be, can he get back to that 2021 type of season that he had, where he was really good outside the tackles. Now, Minnesota's a base inside zone, outside zone team. But if you look at the PFF statistics for Trey Potts, over half of his carries were in gap scheme, where Minnesota's trying to get him outside of the tackles. They're trying to get him BC and D gap, get him in space, because that's where Trey Potts wins. When Trey Potts can get you in space, that's where he's going to hopefully win. And now he's not a guy with deep speed. I wouldn't say that. I think his longest career carry here was about 50 yards. So there were opportunities for him to potentially house it, but that's not his game. But for him, it's get him the ball in the swing game, the screen game, outside the tackles. And if Penn State is able to do that, I think Trey Potts can be a successful Big Ten running back 100%.
You mentioned that sample size that we saw in 2021 when Ibrahim goes down with that injury during a fantastic performance against Ohio State. Six touchdowns, 552 yards in only 5 games during that season in 2021 for Potts. He comes back this past season, as you said, almost 500 yards, 3 touchdowns on 101 carries. And I guess, I mean, look, you're a running back. You know the situation. Ibrahim's going to get a bunch of carries in front of you. How would you kind of, I guess, categorize the way you saw Potts handle that kind of role? The guy who's going to be coming in maybe with a cold hand into the game. You're not quite sure when those opportunities are going to come. For instance, against Penn State, he had 5 carries for 7 yards. Ibrahim had 30 carries for 102 yards. So what's your thought there? Because I'd imagine it's going to be very much a similar approach here with Penn State. I can't imagine Ja'Juan Seider disrupting what he has going on with Singleton and Allen in a significant way to get Potts involved in the game plan. Certainly think he'll be a part of it, but to me, on the surface, this is more of a wrinkle than it is kind of blowing up the running back plan.
Yeah, and that's where, if again, I don't pretend to be an elite Penn State mind, but I think you laid it out on the table pretty well, where I think Potts is well aware that he's going to be the third running back in this room for this year, for next year. And he's okay with that because he's able to go home. And that's where it is very tough for him, or I think for any running back, to come in and have a cold hand, because when you do get your 5 to 8 carries a game, you want to make the most of them. So maybe you're pressing a little bit. And so that's where we did see him in that kind of relegation role at times last year. I think he did the best in terms of what you can do for being a cold running back. Say you come in fourth series of the game in the second quarter to spell. I mean, I think maybe if he learned anything from this past season, it's he doesn't need to press. He can just let Trey Potts be Trey Potts, and Trey Potts doesn't have to be Mohamed Ibrahim in that instance. And so that's where it's going to be. I mean, we've seen that sample size in 2021. Or when he was the feature back, he forced 21 missed tackles in those 4 games. I mean, that's really tough to do. I mean, that's very encouraging, obviously, but there were points last season where Minnesota just went, we know what Trey Potts can do, but we obviously want to give it to Mo. Now, I would argue that's a pretty good decision considering he's, again, one of the greatest running backs to ever don the uniform here. I think was number 1 or number 2 in the country in yards after contact. But I think for him, it's if one of the 2 running backs in front of him goes down, or if Penn State wants to use him in kind of a scat back role, that makes a ton of sense to me. Again, we've seen the flashes here at Minnesota where it's like Trey Potts can be a guy who gets 15 to 18 carries a game and be really successful at that. Get him in space, let him do his thing. That's where he's going to succeed. But if they're just going to run in between the tackles, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And that's why Minnesota kind of deployed him the way that they did. But we've seen the flashes from Trey Potts in 2021. He seemingly was trying to find his footing at times last year because we didn't see him get a ton of consistent carries throughout the Big Ten season last year. But I cannot stress it enough. The opportunity for him to go home is the big selling point here. To provide depth, I think that's something he's totally okay with, to go back home to Penn State and go back home to Pennsylvania. But if his number is called upon, I think he can be if he's your 3rd running back in the room, I think you have a pretty good running back room ahead of you.
Yeah, we think they have a pretty good running back room too. And before we let you go, look, Minnesota's not on the schedule for Penn State this year, but you're always keeping an eye, and these 2 teams have met in recently. You've talked about it. There's been some staff changes. I'll throw in Kirk Shiraka heading to Rutgers. Ibrahim has moved on. Tanner Morgan era is over, like the Sean Clifford era is over here. Can you give us a quick 2-minute summary of where the Minnesota Golden Gophers program is? And at running back, I think where a lot of us are curious what the solution is going to be there for them.
Yeah, it's going to be year 7 already of the PJ Fleck era here at Minnesota. They've won 9 games in 2019, 2021, 2022. So, I mean, there's a lot of fans that have that asterisk maybe next to it because all of that came with no Big Ten West titles, which it's incredible to say because they've been very close, 3 of the last 4 years, to a West title, and then they just haven't been able to get it done. But to your point, they've got a brand new offensive coordinators in, and Greg Harbaugh and Matt Simon, 2 guys who worked underneath Kirk Shiraka. They've still got one of the best defenses outside of that Penn State game in the country. And Joe Rossi, who ended up having this as the number 2 third down defense in the country, top 10 in total yards allowed, total points allowed. It was just that whiteout game where they laid the egg, which is obviously unfortunate. But that's where you look at the running back room. Minnesota brought in a transfer of their own, and Sean Tyler from Western Michigan, who was all MAC the last 2 years, 1,000-yard rusher. I've seen him a couple times here in the spring. He's one of the most explosive running backs that I have covered here. He's very, very fast. Not a guy that's going to get a ton of carries. They're also excited about a couple of young freshmen in Zach Evans and Darius Taylor. Darius Taylor, they were able to get out of the state of Michigan with the Wolverines, trying to flip him all the way up until National Signing Day. Plus, they've got an experience back there in Bryce Williams, who was the 3rd down back for them last year. So that's where, how did it all work last year? Mo would be your feature back. Trey Potts would spell him if he needed a few carries or a series off, and then Bryce Williams would come in on 3rd down. So it's going to look very, very different because the 2 guys who had double-digit carries or triple-digit carries last season, and Ibrahim and Potts, are now gone. Plus, you have an offensive coordinator change. I think this offense is going to look very different in year 7 here for PJ Fleck. They're going to throw the ball, in my mind, as often as we've seen a Minnesota offense do, which is what they should, because that's where their skill is their pass catchers are as good as I've seen in the 7 years that Fleck has been here. And they've got as talented of a running back in Ethan Kaliakmanis, who got his first career start in a wideout game in Happy Valley. So there's a lot of optimism about Ethan. There's optimism about this offense, but it's going to be, is this the year with Ohio State and Michigan on the schedule that Minnesota can get over the hump?
Yeah, Ohio State and Michigan always on the schedule here. It's a daunting task, and
Yeah.
and we'll look forward to your coverage over with the Minnesota at 24/7 Sports. Thanks so much, Ryan, for some perspective on the Pots pickup, and we appreciate that.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right. Let's shift gears to the current Penn State roster. Spring ball is well underway, and it's nearly complete. Next Saturday is the blue-white game back in Beaver Stadium. We're excited for that opportunity to see some scrimmage action, reverting back more to that familiar form now that they have better numbers on the offensive line compared to last season. So a big chance for younger players to step into that spotlight. There are a bunch of them to know, and we'll start to work our way through those positions in a moment, but focusing on this transfer class for Penn State. 4 guys already on board, 2 incoming this summer, and Daniel Gallen hops in now. We're going to be joined by Mark Brennan in a moment, but Daniel and I were on the practice field together on Tuesday night. We had our notes, and we've had a bunch of updates from this week over for our VIP subscribers at Lions247.com. This Thursday show gives us a chance to kind of gather some of that stuff, and as I said, we'll do that with Mark in a moment, but we just discussed Trey Potts for the last 15 minutes or so with Ryan there, Daniel, and clearly this is a spot where we said maybe it's a luxury if you can get it, but right now Penn State seems to be in the luxury. That's what they're looking for. I mean, they're looking for maybe another pickup at the defensive tackle position after spring ball to kind of fortify things there. Now they fortify the running back depth chart. This is a Big Ten championship quality roster, in my opinion. I think the depth chart reflects that. And now you're starting to see Penn State pluck these other pieces that really give you a solidified feel about this roster.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're at this point of the year and you're thinking about roster needs, and number 3 running back is one of the ones that's at the top of the list, I think you're in a pretty good spot. And I think that Potts pickup, I think that a lot of people that follow the program pretty closely know how important it is. And I think that when you look at how last year finished with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, being able to carry the load for much of the season with all the departures and the injury to Kevon Lee, I think that people knew that it's going to be hard to do that again, or that's a situation that you don't necessarily want to be in. So I think that Penn State really addressed a need right now. And when you look at the roster, I think that the things that come to mind are, okay, Dante Cephas will be here in couple weeks, couple months. That'll make the wide receiver room look a little bit different. And then from there, I think that defensive tackle is maybe the one that stands out to a lot of people. But I think James Franklin has said they're not going to add size just to add size. And as we've covered, there's not a lot of those guys walking around right now. It's if someone, is a Big Ten quality starter at defensive tackle who's 6'4", 320 pounds. They're probably not in the portal. They're probably not on the market right now.
And we'll see there's going to be that secondary wave of transfer portal names. It's a shorter window than what we saw post regular season in December, but it's coming our way very soon. You'll see some movement, I'd imagine, leaving the Penn State roster like we see after the conclusion of spring practices, but perhaps more movement of bringing in talent. Let's look at this transfer portal class now as we also include Mark Brennan in the conversation here. Look, we just talked about Potts and that pickup, but a couple of guys already on campus in key position rooms. At cornerback, Storm Duck, a former all-conference player with North Carolina, a guy who a lot of people think would be preparing for the NFL draft right now had it not been for some of the injuries he dealt with as a Tar Heel. And then Malik McClain in year 3 at the college level. Big-bodied wide receiver. His physical frame certainly stands out. Still working to gain comfort in this new offensive scheme on a new campus, but physically a lot of pieces to like in place with him. And then from a specialist perspective, Daniel, Riley Thompson, Alex Felkins, Thompson coming from Florida Atlantic on a scholarship, Felkins a walk-on after a record-setting career with the Columbia program as a place kicker. And each of those guys, as you discussed with Stacey Collins this week, a special teams coordinator with Penn State, you documented this in the notes, competition across the board in the specialist room.
Definitely. I think that in terms of under the radar storylines, I think that this specialist group is one of them. You're replacing 3 starters from that group last year in Chris Stoll, Barney Amore, and Jake Pinniger. And then on top of that, Stacey Collins brought this up. Chris Stoll won the Manley Award as the nation's best long snapper. Barney Amore, I think, was better than any of us would have expected him to be. And he has potentially played his way into having a shot at a roster spot in the NFL. So it's a talented group that you have to replace. And the theme for Stacey Collins when we were talking to him was competition. when we were out there at practice on Tuesday night, we saw Alex Falcons working with that first field goal group. Stacey Collins said that Falcons and Sanders Sahadak are rotating with the 1s and 2s, on a daily basis. And he said that both have been, very consistent, which is what he's looking for. And then Riley Thompson, the FAU transfer, is competing with Alex Paqueta, for that punting job. Gabe Wosu and Mitchell Groh are also factor in there, which Stacey Collins brought up. And it does sound like Wosu is the leader for the field goal jobs, or the kickoff job. Kickoff specialist. Yeah, we talked about this, I think, last year in terms of really the narrow roles that James Franklin and Stacey Collins give some of these guys. I think that we talked about it a little bit with, sometimes Sahadak would do the kickoffs if they wanted to, potentially give a different look with the left-footed kicker, long field goal kicker, short field goal kicker. And Stacey Collins said that that's really what they're going to continue to do. He said it helps when you have Jordan Stout who can do everything, but they're really looking at how can they fit these guys into these very specific roles that puts the Penn State special teams unit in the best position moving forward.
And that was an area last year, kickoff specialist, where they got that kind of ironed out by midseason. Jake Pinniger took the reins there, but Gabe Nwosu, who James Franklin declared last week as the favorite at that position. Just a reminder, he's 6'6", 280 pounds, potentially kicking the ball off for this Penn State program. And let's bring in Mark Brennan now, because it sounds like Gabe Nwosu could fit in that defensive line room just based on physical measurements alone. And James Franklin said it in practice on Tuesday. They're not hurting for numbers in that room. They've got some missing pieces right now, guys working their way back from some injuries, bumps and bruises, as he likes to say, but went on the record Tuesday saying he feels like this could be the deepest defensive end group that they have had in terms of guys who are playable, in terms of guys who are ready to make a major impact in game action. And he says that defensive tackle, acknowledging there are some more question marks there, has a lot of numbers in place, but they want to see, as guys work their way back and some of these younger players emerge, sounds like there's a foundation brewing there. But the guy in charge of all this, Mark, is Deion Barnes. And he was very emotional, I thought, and very forthright about those emotions. And you were with him the entire time Tuesday night. Cool transition, going from a player at Penn State, a few years later returning as a graduate assistant, doing that for 3 years, getting to stay on for an analyst, and all of a sudden you're interviewing for your first ever college coaching position, and it's at your alma mater. And 2 weeks later, you're told you have the job. And 1 day later, it's time to start practice in spring ball. What was your kind of experience like with Deion Barnes? You were asking a lot of those questions with him.
Yeah, one quick thing with regard to Trey Potts. I mean, isn't it an indication that there's always something cooking in the transfer portal? It's like we kind of weren't even – I don't know that anybody's necessarily expecting that, but it's kind of what you have to be doing on the college football level anymore is, grinding in that portal. But, yeah, with regard to Deion, I mean, here's a guy, and we've talked about this, that represents so much positive about Penn State. I mean, he was recruited by the Joe Paterno staff. I've said this before, as much as everybody likes to talk about the seniors who stuck with the program through the sanctions, he was part of that freshman class, the Super Six group, with Allen Robinson and Adrian Amos and that crew, who stuck with the program through all of that. These were guys who could have left and gone anywhere. His NFL career, and it was pretty interesting that he talked about how his NFL career didn't last as long as he had hoped. You look at the NFL now and guys who came in with him, Donovan Smith, Adrian Amos, Robinson, these guys are still in the league, still making a bunch of money. His career didn't quite pan out. I mean, Big Ten Freshman of the Year way back when, and his NFL career never really became what a lot of people thought it might be. Rather than mope about it, he got back to coaching at the high school level at Northeast High down in Philadelphia, where he went to school, and was able to parlay that into a GA job at Penn State. And for him to be able to get that job, the thing that kind of stuck out to me, he said that his mom was near tears when she heard that he finally got the job. You can see what this, you could see, I mean, literally see in his eyes kind of what it meant to him. And then the other thing I liked, he said his dad said, okay, well, now you got this, and you got to show why you got this. You got to keep working. You got to keep grinding. So a feel-good story. And listen, we've seen James Franklin. We know the process he goes through when he's hiring people. Has every hire been perfect? No, but he's very thorough. He has a long list. Deion Barnes said it was interesting because he interviewed immediately, and then they brought in candidate after candidate after candidate, and that had to be tough for him. But he waited patiently, and it ended up working out for him. So I love the fact that you're bringing in a young guy who has done a great job on the recruiting trail, who everybody in the room loves. And then the best part about it is he's surrounded by veteran coaches. Daniel mentioned this on a previous podcast. I mean, Manny Diaz, Terry Smith, Dex. I mean, you have these coaches who have been around a long time, and this kid is going to be like a sponge. And I say kid because he is still a kid. I mean, he's still south of 30, right? I mean, or he's right in that area. So I think they got themselves a good coach. And the other thing that was pretty fun to see is when he was a player, he was very shy, very reserved with the media. And this wasn't the most comfortable thing for him to come out for his first press conference, but I thought he handled himself extremely well. And, none of that speaks to the X's and O's and everything else. But I just think in terms of first impressions, I thought he did a really nice job. And having seen him around the program the last few years, I think Penn State got themselves a good coach.
And one other thing that he said, what I thought was pretty cool, is he's remained engaged with John Scott Jr. Bound as a sounding board, as hey, different ways to approach things on the practice field, and he's been able to maintain that relationship. Of course, John Scott, as we referenced recently, was back here on campus for Pro Day, representing the Detroit Lions now in the NFL. But also James Franklin has been an important sounding board for Deion Barnes. It's not just hey, I'm hiring you, good luck, go off and figure it out. This isn't foreign territory. I know that Ty Howell had experience at the college level as a position coach, as a coordinator even, but at 29 years old, he was given the reins to a tight end room that was pretty impressive in terms of talent in that group. A lot to like about this defensive line group, and I think James Franklin understands that, every coach in every room is going to be a different situation. Does Terry Smith need to be checked in on as much as Deion Barnes will this season? I don't think so. But it sounds like that there's really been a communal aspect to this, because the timing's interesting when you hire a guy and you getting right to work on the spring ball field. But I think it's been a really strong move from the aspect of this locker room's in a really good place. And I think it was enhanced by this decision based on everything we've heard from leaders, from the guys in that defensive line room. It wasn't a default hire. As you said, they interviewed Deion right away, and then he had to sit through 2 weeks of them talking to other players and waiting for stuff. And you can only imagine the anxiety that comes with that. But at the end of the day, they circled back to him. Manny Diaz circled back to him. James Franklin did. And now he's working with quite a room. And I think we should jump into that room a little bit right now, because Zane Durant was one of the players that we had a chance to speak with on Tuesday. And James Franklin told us a bit before that he has flashed on a consistent basis. He's added the weight. And Durant said a big part of that is he wants to up his game as a run defender. He feels like last year his best usage was as a third down pass rush specialist. Now he's up to 282 pounds. He was 275 out in Pasadena. He was 260 pounds when they announced him on National Signing Day as part of that 2022 class. And I know last year a lot of us were kind of sprinting toward the breakout happening. Didn't really need to happen because of what was ahead of him in the defensive line room. You didn't have to thrust him in that kind of role. But I'll tell you what, Daniel, it certainly feels right now that he's primed for takeoff. When we have so many names in that 2022 class that we want to point to, and Abdul Carter and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen and Drew Aller, of course, and you go down the list with guys like KJ Winston and Cam Miller who are working for their own breakout. Zane Durant, I feel like, could be a speeding train come September that people are like, oh, that's right. We heard all this great stuff about Zane Durant when he got to campus, and now look at where he is in year two.
Yeah, I think that when you look at his trajectory a little bit, we heard so much about him last winter. I'm living in a construction zone right now, so there's a lot of background noise. But we heard so much about him when he got onto campus, but I think that you kind of knew that even with all of that buzz, when you actually got onto the field playing defensive tackle as a freshman in the Big Ten, there's going to be a little bit of an adjustment. And I think that, like you said, his best work seemed to be in some of those pass rush situations. We saw him as the as the nose tackle in that, or is sometimes the only down lineman in the Prowler package at times. But I think the fact that we're still hearing about him and that he is, he's kind of returned to that offseason, buzz, I think that bodes really well. And especially the fact that it's happening in kind of a different way, where I feel like last year it was a lot of talk about those pass rushing skills, about that size, about that athleticism, that ability to get into the backfield. And now that it's with the running game, I think that he's becoming a lot more well-rounded. There are going to be reps up for grabs at that position on the interior. So I think that this is a good trajectory for a young player who is playing a position that takes some development to really be able to contribute at and to really be able to play at a high level at.
Durant was one of 6 defensive tackles last year who played at least 170 snaps on the season. The only guy they lost from that group was the snap leader in PJ Mustipher. He was approaching 500 snaps on the season. But you're back with Hakeem Beamon. You're back with Devon Ailey's. You're back with Keziah Izzard. Now, Izzard is a guy who's been out of sight here during spring ball in terms of putting on the pads. Hakeem Beamon is someone that we didn't see this past Tuesday, but a lot of excitement about what he's going to be able to do this year. But Jordan Vandenberg is another player that I think we shouldn't set aside, a guy who came to campus in kind of a swift fashion from the JUCO level, Iowa Western Community College, came to campus, dazzled the staff with some of his testing numbers, and all of a sudden he was here. It was a very quick process, and all of a sudden he was popping up in a rotational role last year. I'm curious about him. We've heard that he has been consistent this spring. We've heard he's taken advantage of more of a workload. That's kind of what we're seeing happen at the linebacker room as well, which we'll get to. But there's been a bigger workload for some guys in the defensive tackle room, and just a couple other names to throw out there. And I know Daniel's mentioned this one before a few times. Caleb Artis. As it may be that kind of a big body defensive tackle in the making. It might not be the answer in September 2023, but it might be coming down the pipeline. And then Davon Townley, according to Zane Durant, he's the guy who's really started to get it, what it takes to rush from the interior. That's a bit of a transitive process when you're spending your life on the edge or your football life on the edge, and all of a sudden you're asked to go inside as a defensive tackle. Sounds like those pieces are starting to come together. Still putting Davon Townley more in the 2024 category and a guy that we need to watch. But depth pieces are great on the defensive line. You're going to want those. It's still an area we're watching with the transfer portal. But Mark, I think when you start on the edge, like James Franklin did on Tuesday, Deion Barnes, this has been his expertise in a lot of ways, guys, getting them to fly off the edge, get after the quarterback, put that pressure on. He's got all those pieces. Chop Robinson, the buzz is sky high there. It remains intact. Adisa Isaac sounds like everything the way he finished last season has carried over into 2023. And then Denai Dennis Sutton apparently is spending more time in the weight room than just about everybody except maybe Tony Rojas.
Yeah, one other guy, Ty Blanding. I mean, at defensive tackle, I wanted to throw that in because they're very high on him. He's obviously not here yet. But yeah, when James Franklin says they're as deep as they've been and as talented as they've been at defensive end, that's really saying something when you think about some of the players that they've had go through this program, during his tenure. And I mean, listen, you're not even throwing in a guy like Smith Vilbert, who I think everybody's kind of forgotten about. So we'll see where
Zariah Fisher. I mean, that's the thing. You can keep going down this list and you can work yourself a 3 or 4 deep. And the key is, some guys are going to need to play a lot of football and not everybody's going to get to play a bunch.
Right. But then let's go back to that Prowler package that Daniel's talking about and some of the things they were able to do with all of those different players, putting them at different spots. And then you start mixing and matching those defensive tackles, a guy like Zane Durant or a guy like Hakeem Beamon, who are not the biggest guys, but who are super quick. And when you're talking about the Prowler package, you're talking about bringing pressure from everywhere and lining up linebackers in different spots and bringing safeties and corners and all of that stuff. And that's what makes it really fun. And that's where let's go back to Deion Barnes and, being able to learn under a guy like Manny Diaz, who has all these creative looks, is just a really cool thing. But I think when you look at defensive end, I mean, yes, they're very deep, but I think you look at that big three of Chop, and obviously of Adisa Isaac, however they're going to work those three. And then if Smith Vilbert ends up being what he was for that one bowl game, again, then you're even adding more. And then you mentioned the Fishers and the other people. but it just gives them so many different options, and it allows them to be fresh. And when we saw some of those great Penn State defensive lines in the early 2000s, or the mid 2000s, I'm sorry, the early 2000s weren't really a great time for Penn State defensive line and Penn State football, but those mid to late 2000s, with the Aaron Mabins and all those guys that they were kind of rolling through there, that was one of the real keys, is having that depth. You talk about PJ Mustipher approaching, 500 snaps or whatever it was, and then you compare that to what Jair Brown played, and it was far more numbers, I would assume, for Jair Brown. And the key is these guys are so big and they're pounding on these offensive linemen, and to be able to rotate through is just a really big thing.
Yeah, Jair Brown had 680 snaps last season, right in that range.
And what was
defensive players. PJ was right around 470 last season.
Yeah.
So
and if you
him and
the ends, it'll be less even, I'll bet.
Yeah, and there was a separation, just to go back to what I said. You may feel like you can play 6 guys, but the way that you're going to kind of skew those snaps is the really curious part, because you had Beeman and Mustipher go over 400 snaps last season. No one else really came close to 300 snaps. A lot of guys landed between like 170 and 280 or so. So we'll see what happens at defense. There's just so many names to work off of here, and there's tremendous competition, and there's some fresh eyeballs there. And now you've got Torrance Brown as a GA, a guy who played here as well. So moving parts there, but a lot of familiarity. Devon Illies seems to be making those strides as a leader. PJ Mustipher, that presence being lost is huge for this entire locker room. But you think about what he meant to the defensive line room. We hear that Illies, we hear that Adiza Isaac and Akeem Beeman are stepping up in that regard as far as leadership goes. And although he has been absent from spring ball workout, which isn't a surprise because James Franklin alluded to it at his press conference back in March, that we wouldn't probably see much of Keziah Izzard as he works his way back from some of those bumps and bruises. But he was really impressive last year, I thought, as the season went on. Remember, he was gone, not part of the game plan for all of September, much like Smith Vilbert working with the scout team, didn't get to see him in game action. That changed in October. He ended up finishing second among all defensive tackles in 4 tackles for loss. He led the group in sacks on the season, despite missing the first month of the year. And I know he's missing time now, but I think Keziah Izzard is being slept on a little bit right now in terms of the impact he has already made in a Penn State uniform and maybe where he can go from here. All right, we've teased it enough, I think, without getting to quarterback. We've talked about other positions, but Drew Aller is the name to know nationally when you talk about Penn State football and what they might be able to achieve next fall. Drew Aller, you were on those notes, Daniel Gallen, Lions247.com. There were plenty of them. Him and Bo Prabula engaged in this competition, talking about that, saying all the right things. When is the competition going to be over? James Franklin says when it's clear who the starting quarterback is. So stay tuned. This isn't something I think we're going to get a resolution on minutes after the blue-white game. I think there's a chance that we're going into August and still talking about a quarterback competition, even if all of us kind of know where this thing's going to land in when West Virginia comes to town.
Yeah, definitely. I think that this is the first time we've had Haller in this type of environment. All the other times he's spoken with us have been in kind of, sit down type environments, like before the Rose Bowl and in February when we had that second year player availability. So this is, Aller fresh off the practice field, still in his gear talking to us, which we haven't had before. And, it's really interesting to hear him talk because he is just, very sure of himself. He made a quip about being a 19-year-old in a room that has some 22 and or on a team that has some 22 and 23-year-olds in regards to a question about leadership. But, he doesn't sound like a 19-year-old when it comes to how he talks, his speech patterns, and just kind of his composure and, how thoughtful he is with a lot of the questions that he gets. So, I think that he looks the part of the number one quarterback. When we watch him in practice, he sounds the part of the number one quarterback when he's talking with us. And by all accounts, behind closed doors, it sounds like that is continuing a pace there. It was interesting to talk to Kalen King about Drew Aller and going up against him in practice. And he said that Aller is a ball placement expert, that when Kalen King is going against a wide receiver, when Aller is at quarterback, Aller is probably going to be able to put the ball where only the wide receiver can get it. Omari Evans said the same thing yesterday, that when he's doing a rep with Aller, that he knows that it's either going to be him or nobody getting the ball. And Evans also said that Allard's arm strength is just pretty off the charts, and he said that there's a pretty big, that you can tell the difference when it's Allard and Prevula throwing the ball to him. So I think that Drew Allard seems pretty comfortable. The leadership piece has been a very exhaustive topic of conversation this offseason, and it does seem like that Allard is one of those guys who is, having to exit his comfort zone a little bit to be a little bit more vocal, while still trying to lead by example and set a tone that way. And I think from what we've heard, I think that that's what's happening for Penn State. So, I think that James Franklin will probably, not drag this out, but I think he'll let it linger out there in terms of a competition into August. Who knows how far into August? But I think that, I think both of these quarterbacks have all said the right things, done the right things. And it seems behind the scenes that the work that they've put in is really becoming apparent on the practice field.
The last time James Franklin had a new quarterback to name, Tommy Stevens left after spring ball. It left year 3, Sean Clifford, year 2, Will Levis through the summer. And we ultimately found out that Sean Clifford was the guy in mid-August as preseason camp was starting to near a conclusion. Of course, this is very different than a year 3 Sean Clifford. This is year 2 with the #1 quarterback recruit in the country that a lot of people are clinging Penn State's higher ceiling to here in 2023 and moving forward. And a few yards away from him, while he was chatting with media, I had a chance to catch up with Bo Prabula. Obviously, he wants the job too, and he thinks he could be pretty darn good in a Penn State uniform at the quarterback position. Just some facts on Bo Prabula. He's now up to 6'2", 208 pounds. Last season, he was sub 200. I think he was right around 197, 198. With that weight, feels like he's still as fast as he's been in his life. And what we've heard about Bo Prabula, what we know about Bo Prabula is he's go on the gas pedal day in, day out. I think there's some parallels to draw between his personality and Sean Clifford's personality. He acknowledged that. There's a bit of a chip on the shoulder, he says, he's carried since youth football. Anyone who's come in contact with Sean Clifford, interviewed Sean Clifford, you're going to know that the chip on his shoulder has been important to his journey as well. But what maybe separates Prabula here a little bit is in this conversation when you measure him and Allard, and it's been addressed by the coaching staff, is the athleticism is really difficult to ignore. He's got the fastest shuttle time on record for Penn State going back to 2012 with this big board in their weight room, 4.11 in the shuttle. He's out of these 10 pounds. He's a guy whose footwork has really cleaned up in the pocket, but it's what he can do beyond the pocket. I know he wants to talk about himself as a passer. Mike Yurcich has been very complimentary, but Bo Prabula was considered kind of a multi-positional Power 5 level athlete at the high school level. And he showed what he could do at quarterback, 2 really impressive playoff runs with Central York. But what we've heard from James Franklin, what we've heard from Mike Yurcich, it takes me back to 2018. It takes me back to Tommy Stevens. It's certainly getting it out there for opposing defensive coordinators about potentially using Prabula in a different role. And he says he is open to doing whatever it takes to help this team. Mark, I think we're going to see Bo Prabula on the field in some interesting ways early this year. Maybe they wait until getting the Big Ten play to break out some packages and kind of spring that loose. I think Tommy Stevens, when we saw him really come into play, it was against maybe Ohio State in October of that, or late September of that 2018 season. But to me, Bo Prabula is going to be a factor for this offense this year. I don't think he's going to be your starting quarterback unless something happens to Drew, but he is going to be a relevant part of this process in a way that maybe the backup quarterback hasn't been utilized in the last several seasons.
Yeah, I think they learned their lesson a couple years ago, right? I mean, when you go into Iowa and your starting quarterback gets hurt, then, where do you go? I mean, even last year, they were playing Allard, relatively early in the season in blowouts. He was at least getting a snap here and there, or a couple snaps here and there, at least, running out onto the field. And, I think we all realize where this quarterback thing is going. I mean, you don't have people, talking about Drew Allard the way that they do. I mean, he's going to be the guy, knock on wood, barring injury, but you have to have a backup quarterback ready. And again, we learned that 2 years ago when Penn State didn't, and it really, the entire season unraveled. So you want everybody to stay healthy, but the odds of that happening for an entire season, I mean, something could happen at any moment. So if you're going to get Beau Pribula ready, why not try to utilize his athleticism kind of however you can do it? I just think it makes complete sense. And I think they learned their lesson from a couple of years ago. And I also think, talking about these quarterbacks, the whole leadership thing, I know it's been kind of beaten to death, but it is really, really important, because you look over on defense, and I was just thinking about, Kalen King was there the other day, and clearly a vocal leader, right? I mean, this guy, you could ask him about anything, and he's really in his comfort zone talking. I mean, Curtis Jacobs, really in his comfort zone talking. Devon Elise, really in his comfort zone. You can see where these are vocal guys. When you look at the offense, where is that going to come from? It's not coming from the running back room, and that's not a knock on the young running backs. They're just not those types of people. You look at the receiver room. I just don't know. Maybe
Keandre's been a pretty across the board the guy who has stepped up that we've heard on offense. But from a personality perspective, some of the other, if you just say these guys are good football players, they got to be leaders. Nick Singleton doesn't really match that personality profile. Katron, I don't want to say these guys can't be lead by example guys, and they have plenty of those, but we're talking about vocal, step up, demonstrative kind of leaders. Keandre Lambert-Smith fits that bill, but Olu Fashanu doesn't necessarily fit that bill, and we're still learning about these quarterbacks, although it does sound like they've taken the necessary steps. And I think to build off your point, these guys are taking their lumps against what may be the Big Ten's best defense, one of the top defenses across college football this year.
Great secondary.
They have taken their lumps, and they're learning from it, and it's important for them when things get chaotic, when it's a bad day for the offense. And by the way, Tuesday was apparently the best day for the offense during spring ball, according to James Franklin. But you need to be able to look at your quarterback, whether it's Beau Pribula or Drew Aller, and say, okay, next play. Okay, next play. You can't be dwelling on it. And that's the learning curve. When you mentioned Drew Aller, he might be 6'5", 240 pounds, but he is 19 years old, and he's trying to command an offense that features, 50 guys on that side of the football, and you need to respect from each one of those. So it's going to be fun to follow these guys' progress. And thus far, what we're hearing about Jackson Smolik maybe makes you feel a little bit better. We didn't think Jackson Smolik was going to come in here and not be the QB3, because you've got two walk-on guys coming this summer, and that's all that you have going on at quarterback beyond Pribula and Aller. But hearing the way that Franklin and Yurcich have discussed what Jackson Smolik has been able to accomplish thus far through almost 4 weeks of spring football, they sound like they are developing, or they feel like they'll be able to develop a viable third option at the quarterback position before that kickoff against West Virginia. Why it was so paramount to get him on campus in January, get the ball rolling in this development. And there's not a lot of places to hide on the practice field right now for a Penn State quarterback. There's only 3 of you, so there's a lot of opportunities right now. And it sounds like Jackson Smolik also taking his lumps, but also building and learning off of those experiences at quarterback. Let's shift over to linebacker, because we mentioned the hype train behind Zane Durant, and it's long existed with Drew Aller, but right now, Tony Rojas is really difficult to ignore. It feels like every time in our practice notes, we're talking about what he's doing on the field, how he's looking. Last week, I noted that if he was still under 220 pounds, it was really going to be hard for me to wrap my head around that. Turns out he's not. James Franklin said he has added 29 pounds since January enrollment. Franklin kind of said, I'm not sure how that's possible to be good weight, but it is, and we can confirm it's good weight. So that puts Tony Rojas at right about 225 pounds right now at 6'2". This is a guy who showed up to campus sub 200. Daniel, choo-choo, all aboard. That linebacker room has some impressive returners, but this guy's getting on the field, and it's going to happen fast.
I think the one way that you can really see the impression that Tony Rojas has made is, when we're talking to Omari Evans on Wednesday, he's asked about which guys on the defensive side of the ball have impressed him, and the first guy he says is Tony Rojas. That's coming from a wide receiver who, all these guys overlap in practice, but from a wide receiver you might think, okay, a cornerback, a safety, something like that, but he went right to Rojas, and he said that it's just the way that Tony Rojas has come in and approached what he's done, his work. I think Kalen King has said something similar, that he is someone that they're seeing come in early, stay late, do the extra work that he needs to be able to put himself into this position. And so I think that there are going to be reps there. It's still a deep linebacker room, but we've seen over the past couple of years that they will rotate through that 2 deep over the course of a game. Jonathan Sutherland, who began the year as that Sam linebacker, is gone, so I think that there will be an opportunity for Tony Rojas to blow by that redshirt threshold, whether it's special teams, being a second teamer, some way there. I think that he is going to be one of the guys that really, forces his way onto the field. Stacey Collins, who is the outside linebackers coach, in addition to a special teams coordinator, duties, had some interesting insight on him on Tuesday night and talking about the transition from playing closer to the line in college and or in high school, and now having to play a little bit more in space. And he leaned on Tony Rojas's experience as a running back at Fairfax High School in Virginia. Tony Rojas was the Washington Post's Offensive Player of the Year for what he was able to do as a running back for Fairfax. I think over 2,000 yards, over 30 touchdowns, unstoppable. But he said that vision has translated over to the defensive side of the ball, that Tony Rojas is able to see things a little bit differently, a little bit clearly. And that has also helped with his transition to the college game.
It sounds like the processing part of the physical part is great, but it sounds like the way he's processing the game through his first 8, 9, 10 Penn State football practice on a college field has been the impressive part. I think Kalen King said he's flying around 20 miles an hour, and that's it being incorporated on the practice field. Zane Durant actually said, there's just no hesitation. He's attacking plays, he's making plays, and it's just not something you normally see. I asked Zane Durant, how rare is that to see an early enrolled freshman just take to the college game when they're surrounded by guys who are 21, 22, have played a bunch of Big Ten football? And he said, well, for me, it's not so rare. I saw Abdul Carter do it last year as part of my freshman class. And, of course, Abdul Carter went on to become an All-American freshman. You've got Carter. Could play some middle linebacker this year. We saw him at the Will last year. We've seen Tony Rojas working at both the Will and the Sam. And, of course, we've got Curtis Jacobs, who has that positional versatility, whether it be the Sam or the Will position. Dom DeLuca earned a scholarship last year. And another top 24/7 linebacker is going to be joining Rojas and Tamir Robinson in this freshman class this summer when Kavion Keys comes to town. So a lot going on in that room, but it's really difficult to look away from Tony Rojas when you talk about early enrollee buzz to this point. We'll get a chance to see him. So will you at the Blue-White game next Saturday, but really impressive early returns right now on a guy who has come a long way in a short period of time. Mark, I'm sorry to cut you off there. That's the last positional nugget I wanted to get to here. If you've got anything to empty from your notebook for the week, go for it, but have at it, Mark.
No, the Tony Rojas, the thing, and Tyler, you've seen this and I think you've seen it too, Daniel, but when we've been at practice, the thing that has stood out to me outside of his physical build is that the two alphas in that room, are obviously Curtis Jacobs and Abdul Carter. And that's not a knock on anybody else, but you can tell who the guys are. But when they're going through drills, the number 3 guy every time seemingly fighting his way up that list. And that's not an official thing. This is just how things kind of play out. Is Tony Rojas. He's like, no, I'm up here in this group. I'm going to be the number 3 to number 4 guy going through, hitting the sled or going through the agility drill or whatever. And again, that's not a knock on anybody else. But I think, it's typically Curtis Jacobs, who's the leader, and then Abdul Carter, who's obviously an alpha dog in that room. And then when you see Rojas stepping up in that regard, I just think that's, to me, that's pretty interesting to see from a young guy. And I wanted to circle back just a little bit to the leadership, because I think when you look at the offense, one of the good things is that you have a few guys on that offensive line who I think really have the ability to step up as leaders. And one is Caden Wallace, Landon Tangwell, and Nick Dawkins, even though he's not played a lot. I think these 3 guys, I would look, if you're looking at offense of who's going to step up as those vocal leaders, I think those are 3 guys. Olu isn't going to be that guy. That's just, he's super intelligent, an awesome player, going to be maybe the first offensive tackle off the board in next year's draft, but he's not that vocal guy. But when you're looking for the vocal leaders, as the quarterbacks are developing that, I think those are 3 of the guys. Now, is that great just to have? You don't necessarily have that everywhere else, maybe not. But I do think to have it on the offensive line, when you're in that huddle and somebody needs to grab somebody and say something, I think it's not bad coming from a big 300-pounder who's vocal, knows how to express themselves in those situations. And again, people may not have heard a lot from Caden Wallace. People may have been disappointed with the way his seasons have gone the last couple seasons, but he is a vocal guy. He's an intelligent guy. Landon was banged up last year, but we know from the time he was in high school, he's very well spoken. You've had him on the pod talking about different things. And then Nick Dawkins is just a different cat altogether. And if he gets his opportunity, it'll be fun to see. But even so, he could still be one of those glue guys in the locker room. So I think that's some of the places where that leadership could come. And just Kalen King, boy, the way that guy has opened up. I mean, just dealing with him. I only got there for the end of his press conference, but just you could ask him any sort of question, and he's got a great answer. And I just thought it was really, I thought that was pretty cool. And I actually liked the other guy that I liked talking to this week was Jalen Reed. I mean, he, he's a little bit out there that I think they're probably a little nervous that he speaks his mind too much. He's telling us about injury.
We need more Jalen Reed. We need more Jalen Reed.
But it's fun at this time of year to have some of these interactions with these guys. And that's why we have at least one of us on every single call. If not two of us, if not three of us in some instances, just to be there. And then to have the availability after practice, that's worked out great. I mean, to have and for people who haven't been following along, this is the first time that I can recall that after every spring practice, they not only have Franklin, but they have an assistant coach and they have multiple players.
Yep.
And it's been really cool in breakout situations because it's more of a scrum. It's not as structured, and guys might be a little bit more, willing to talk than if you're on a Zoom or if it's like a formal thing somewhere. So it's been cool to get to know some of these guys that maybe we haven't talked that much to in the past.
And hopefully our listeners out there have been engaged at Lions247.com. I think we filled about 8 pages on a message board thread this week, dropping all of our notes, context, quotes from these conversations. I believe this week it was 7 or 8 available players. 3 coaches in total were available. We were involved in all of those conversations, and we have all of that content up at Lions247 for our VIP subscribers. Only so much we can get to here on a podcast before we just continue to ramble. So let's put a pin in it for now. Next week, we'll get ready for the blue-white matchup on Saturday. It'd be great to be back at Beaver Stadium. The weather has taken a turn for the better here in Happy Valley finally. So things moving in the right direction. Plenty of basketball personnel conversations still happening over at the message board. Tyler Calvaruso has been doing a great job spotlighting some of the transfer portal targets that have emerged for the Nittany Lions. A lot cooking on the football recruiting realm as well. More visitors due on campus for spring practice. More official visits being lined up for June. Tyler Calvaruso, Brian Doan, Steve Wolfong, Alan True, and our amazing recruiting team will be all over that on a day-by-day basis per usual. Thanks again to Ryan Burns for joining us to talk about the pickup of Trey Potts at running back for Penn State, and my colleagues here at Lions247, Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan. Guys, I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right, that has been our edition of the Lions247 podcast here on a Thursday morning. We'll be back with a couple more episodes next week. In the meantime, I encourage you to check out all of our coverage at Lions247.com. And if you missed it on Tuesday, check out our thorough, in-depth conversation with Brandon Short, who went into a lot on Penn State's NIL realities and opportunities and challenges they face in a very competitive athletic landscape that seems to be changing very rapidly. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donohue. We'll talk to you real soon right here on the Lions247 podcast.